Times have come here, but now they're gone. The soldier sat alone on a waterfront wharf, perched atop one of the pilings, and fighting an insatiable urge to climb higher. He heard the shrill call of gulls, and smelled the briny water, but these sensations seemed muted, distant, pushed into the background. His hands fumbled with a near-empty bottle of alcohol as he stared blankly into the ebbing tide. Born Joshua Conroy Ryder of Olympia, Washington, the soldier was a homegrown local boy. Tall, dark-skinned, and handsome, Ryder had been something of a ladies' man before the war. That situation had changed precipitously in the aftermath of the conflict, and it left him with an ache in his breast and a nagging sense of loss in his mind. A few weeks ago he had been on Mars as part of the peacekeeping operation to regain control of Mariner Colony. Ryder shuddered at the memory. Deep within the bowels of Valles Marineris, almost 4 miles below surface level, the colony was ideally situated to repel a ground assault. The colonists had fashioned rudimentary weapons out of mining equipment, but getting through their defenses had proven surprisingly difficult despite the technological discrepancy between the troops and the entrenched rebels. A well-placed seismic charge could cause a landslide that would bury an entire battalion if they didn't get out of the way in time. This realization would come at the cost of the entire 25th Mobile Assault Group. Cutter rays and heavy digging machines could also be fashioned into effective weapons with only minor modifications, as the troops would soon learn. The rebels had entrenched themselves deep in the canyon, within the mines themselves, making direct assault all but impossible. They couldn't simply be bombed out. The brass wanted the mines intact, which made the attack exponentially more difficult. The disgruntled miner colonists could easily shoot down troop carriers as they descended into the canal, so another approach was required. The troops attempted to brave the cliff walls, rappelling or drifting slowly downward using anti-grav. This too proved unfeasible, as the anti-grav units had been designed to function in Earth-normal gravity, rendering their descent painfully slow, and themselves easy targets. They even tried using seismic probes to locate any surface entrances into the colony there might be, but to no avail. The lack of military intelligence for this mission was astounding. The troops should have been supplied with satellite recon images, topographical maps, personal profiles from the colony manifest, anything. But the brass was suspiciously silent on these matters. The peacekeepers attempted landing further up canal and approaching the colony on foot, which made them sitting ducks from the rim wall to absent friends from the 25th Mag. The conflict had dragged on for months with no end in sight, and the peacekeepers began questioning why they were even here. What was so important that an earthbound government would step in to seize a commercial colony? They had no right. Many of the colonists were not even U.S. citizens, but rather company employees under contract. The company was administered internationally on Earth and had holdings on Mars, Deimos, Phobos, and Ceres, asteroids Vesta and Apophis, a few outposts in the belt, as well as cold fuel mines on Europa and Titan. This was a trans-system corporation that fell outside the jurisdiction of any single Earth government. Yet, here they were, homegrown American boys millions of miles from home, fighting and dying in the rusty sands of another planet. It was more than many of the greener boots could handle. Time dragged on, and morale was at an all-time low when the cavalry finally arrived in the form of a battalion of encapsulated spider-like combat droids, accompanied by a cadre of taciturn scientists. The scientific crew kept to themselves and refused to answer any of the questions directed their way, adding to the air of distrust surrounding them. The combat droids' capsules were fired directly into the canyon, where the mechanoids quickly unfolded and made short work of the rebels. It was a massacre. The mecha skittered right over the rebel barricades and cut a bloody swath through the mining colony. Many a charred human body had had to be removed from the rafters of the mining complex, as it seemed that many of the colonists had taken a sudden interest in free climbing in their final moments. As it turned out, all of this had been more or less unnecessary. The majority of the colonists were dying already from some mysterious illness, which of course the scientists refused to elaborate on. Had the troops simply waited a bit longer, they could have marched in with little resistance. All of this only deepened the mystery as to what was really going on, and prompted the persons at arms to speculate ever more outlandish explanations for the situation. The whole thing proved downright traumatic for the troops. It was the first time many of them had seen combat mecha deployed, the first time they had seen robots slaughter humans wholesale, and the experience shook them to the core of their conditioning. Human-on-human violence was something they understood and had been mentally prepared for, but this? The fact that the combat mecha were on their side did little to assuage the soldiers' consciences. These feelings were only compounded by the lack of information coming from the higher-ups. It smacked of withheld need-to-know information, leaving the enlisted men and women feeling used and sullied by their own participation in the whole debacle. Everything had come to a head for Ryder as he waited impatiently for a dropship to pick up his group and return them to the USS Lexington, which was waiting in orbit. He had been milling about, bored out of his mind, chucking stones around to pass the time, when one of the thrown stones accidentally tripped a pressure mine. It exploded about 10 meters from his position, sending Martian rocks tearing through his pressure suit, smashing his faceplate, and searing into his flesh. Medics were thankfully on hand, otherwise he could have asphyxiated right then and there, exposed to the thin Martian atmosphere. Ryder suffered multiple puncture and burn wounds, particularly to the right side of his face, and the surgeon had been forced to remove an eye. The ruined side of his face, a stark contrast to the fine features on his left, would thenceforth remind him of his own absent-minded folly. Ryder was well into the 5-week return trip on board the Lexington before he regained consciousness. He awoke in Lexington's infirmary, semi-delirious and wrapped like a mummy in thick gauze. Tearing at his wrappings like a madman, the nurse had been forced to sedate him. When he was finally coherent enough to be conscious without restraints, a doctor explained the extent of his injuries in perhaps too much detail. Ryder had fainted, and the medical personnel had stuck him in cryo for the duration of the journey. His next snippet of coherent memory was a vague recollection of being transferred to an earthbound medical transport, probably at Luna Station, though he could not be sure, and of a sharp pain behind where his eye used to be. He had become fully conscious just as the transport was hitting Earth atmo, and an attending nurse had done her best to bring Ryder up to speed. Now, sitting precariously atop the piling on the Seattle waterfront, Ryder brooded over his present situation. He had not finished his term, and thus did not qualify for full veteran benefits. He was owed pay for his time in the service, of course, and compensation for his injuries, but several days in a row had already been wasted standing around in line at the VA, waiting to speak to someone to this effect. He had applied to a few civilian jobs just to cover his bases, only to find that the jobs he was qualified for were already filled by robots. It was the proverbial middle ground between the rock and the hard place. Then there was the unanticipated social stigma. The returning soldiers hadn't exactly expected a hero's welcome, but becoming social pariahs overnight caught them completely off guard. And he had thought troop morale on Mars had been low. By comparison, the public perception of the Martian War was positively abysmal. Many people vehemently disagreed with the supposed reasons for the war, and they were quite vocal about it. Disembarkation at SeaTac spaceport had been hindered by an actual protest over 10,000 strong. The returning GIs had been forced to seek cover to avoid being pelted by random debris the protesters were throwing. As if it's my fault. As if throwing their garbage and angry voices at him could in any way undo the injustice or bring home their loved ones. No, not a hero's welcome by any means. The anger, fear, and rejection was totally unexpected, and it left the soldier with a yawning emptiness screaming in his breast. Ryder's nerves were shot. Earlier today, while walking through the International District and ignoring a sudden urge to climb any vertical structure around him, the sound of gunshots in the distance had triggered a full-on panic attack. He had crouched behind a dumpster as memories of battle flooded back into his awareness with terrifying clarity. The faces of the butchered colonists, frozen in an expression of abject terror, came back to haunt him, shaking Ryder to his very core. It was well over an hour before he recovered enough to move from his odoriferous hiding place, and several more before he could clearly recall how he had gotten there in the first place. He had procured a bottle of 151 proof rum from somewhere, he couldn't quite remember, and had wandered down toward the waterfront, attempting to drown his sorrows as the persistent urge to climb things grew in the back of his mind. Now, sitting atop one of the pilings on the wharf, resisting the urge to climb higher, Ryder tried to take a deep breath through a scratchy throat. He coughed into the crook of his arm, only to see blood on his sleeve as he pulled away. Now, great, now I'm getting sick. With no real friends in the area, no family he cared to see, and no money with which to do so even if he wanted to, he was completely alone, unwanted, useless. There was nothing left for him, no reason to go on. I need to get higher, much higher, maybe then. He stood then atop the piling, drained the remainder of the bottle he had been fiddling with, and chucked it into the water. A loading crane sat unattended across the wharf, and in his increasing delirium the soldier could no longer resist the compulsion to climb to the top of it. Moving stealthily so as not to be seen, he made his way over to the crane and began his perilous ascent. The wind whipped at his body as the soldier scaled the arm of the crane with increasing frenzy. His mind groped inward, vainly searching for the root of this compulsion for achieving greater altitude. It made no sense. Prone to vertigo and deathly afraid of heights, Ryder could find no explanation as to why he felt so desperate to reach the top. Hand over hand, he continued striving upward as his mania steadily increased. His vision was beginning to blur as a bizarre gagging sensation grew in his throat, but still upward he climbed. Reaching the top now, the wind whipped at him. An odd feeling of calm spread over his mind as he beheld the tableau far below. He hesitated a moment with tears streaming down the unaffected side of his face as his body was buffeted by another gust. He shouted into the wind, "This is Private Ryder! Signing off!" before lifting his arms and allowing himself to fall into the awaiting waves below. No to the wind or the sun or the rain, we can be like they are. Don't fear the reaper, baby, take my hand. We'll be able to fly. Baby, I'm your man.